In this lesson, we start learning about different image sampling methods in V-Ray, which are bucket image sampler and progressive image sampler. And this video will be dedicated to bucket image sampler. For this lesson, we'll be using this scene, which has some nice texture and geometric details. Also, I have a hidden rug here, which we use it later on in the lesson. Let's open up our render setting and start setting up our image sampler. V-Ray tab is where you control all the image sampler related settings. So let's go to the image sampler or anti-aliasing rollout. What I want to do is to right click on this UI switcher and switch the entire interface to expert so we can see all the settings. First, you need to define the type of image sampler that you want to use. You have progressive image sampler, which progressively samples the entire image and refines the detail over time. And you have bucket image sampler, which takes a variable number of samples per pixel depending on the difference in the intensity of the pixels, what we talked about in the previous lesson basically. Based on the type of image sampler you choose, you get either bucket image sampler rollout or progressive image sampler rollout down here. In this case, let's set the sampler type to bucket and start explaining different options that you have in its specified rollout. Remember, in the previous lesson, I mentioned that each pixel would get tons of samples, right? We do that process adaptively. That means first we send a few samples to see how that pixel is looking. If those initial samples were having similar values or weren't contrasty enough, that would be great. We don't need more samples and we can read out the value for that pixel. But if those samples were having different values, when I say value, you can think of color, for example, and those values were contrasty enough, we would need more samples per pixel to have a reliable result. So we send more samples. Using min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise threshold values down here, we can control this adaptivity. First, we have min subdivs, which is the minimum or initial samples per pixel, and the real number is the square of the value here, so 8 means 64 samples per pixel. This value should stay at 1 always unless you have freakishly small detail in the scene. The max subdiv is the maximum number of samples per pixel. The noise threshold is the threshold which is used to determine if a pixel needs more sample. Right now, the noise threshold is set to 0.01. If initially we have 2 samples and the difference in their values were more than 0.01, that's an indication that we need more sample. How huge this difference is the main guideline for the software to use more samples between the minimum and maximum numbers. Then we have bucket width and bucket height, which are the maximum size of the render buckets. Now let's start taking a look at how the min and max subdivs and noise thresholds affect the quality of your render. First, let me quickly set up my GI and render elements. In the GI tab, let's set the primary engine to irradiance map and secondary to light cache. In the irradiance map, set the current preset to medium for now, set the subdivs to 70 and interp samples to 25 and light cache, I think it's fine. Now in the render elements tab, add denoiser, GI, lighting, reflection, refraction, and sample rate. Sample rate is a very useful render element that allows us to see how the min and max samples are being distributed, and we're going to be using a lot in this lesson. Now make sure V-Ray denoiser preset is set to mild as always. Also in the V-Ray tab and color mapping rollout, let's set the burn value to 0.15. We definitely talk about color mapping in a specific lesson. Now let me show you a few renders with different min and max subdivs and noise thresholds. In the first render, I have disabled max subdivs and therefore killing off any adaptivity, and the min subdiv was set to 1. That means in theory there would be 1 samples per pixel at least. As you can see, the result is extremely noisy, and also we have jagged edges from the lack of anti-aliasing. And if I check my sample rate pass, because there is no adaptivity, so the samples are distributed equally between the pixels. So it's pure black. There is no information to show here. Also, if I check out other passes like lighting and reflection, you can see they are as well very, very noisy. In the second render, min subdiv was set to 4 and max subdivs was off in this one too. Now each pixel receiving 16 samples, and as you can see the noise is less noticeable. We have a respectable anti-aliasing going on, but again there is no adaptivity here. Also, the render time has increased by 3.5 minutes. Also, we can take a look at the denoiser pass, and as you can see this pass is getting rid of the remaining high frequency noises, but not quite perfectly. In the third render, max subdivs was set to 8 and still min subdivs was set to 8 and still max subdivs was off. Now each pixel can have 64 samples per pixel. First of all, it took 23 minutes to render, but it's very, very clean as you can see. If I set this render as my B side and the previous render as my A side, you can see how cleaner this render is compared to our previous render. But the problem is there is no adaptivity. Some areas that might get cleaned up by using fewer samples, still using that 64 samples per pixel, therefore increasing our render time. From the next render, I introduced adaptivity. First, make sure to enable max subdivs, set the min subdivs to 1 and max subdivs to 4. And the noise threshold is to its default of 0.01. As you can see in the frame buffer, the render that we have is pretty noisy, but quite better compared to our first render, right? Now, if I check out my sample rate pass, we can see where the algorithm uses the min subdivs and where it uses the max subdivs. As you can see, we have 3 colors in this pass, 3 general colors, blue, green, and red. Where the image is blue, that means those areas are simple and just using minimum amount of samples, we have cleaned them up. The green parts are the areas where we have cleaned them up using the specified amount of samples, and they have reached the noise threshold value of 0.01, which is our specified noise threshold in the settings. So those areas are cool too. I mean, they have reached that noise threshold. If that noise threshold was higher, we would have get a noisy result, but they would have been green. But in the red parts, we have used all of the 16 samples per pixel, but still couldn't reach the noise threshold quality. That simply tells us that we need to increase the max subdiv number. If we stay in the sample rate channel and check out the next render, max subdiv number was set to 8 in this one, with the same noise threshold. And as you can see, we have successfully decreased the red parts, and that normally means less noise and higher quality renders. And if I go to the RGB pass, you can see it's a lot cleaner and more noise free compared to our previous render. In the next render, max subdivs was set to 16, and it is a bit cleaner compared to our previous render, but the render time did not increase that much, and that is because those extra samples only being used where need be. If I go to the sample rate pass, you can see compared to our previous render, the red parts are becoming more greenish and the green parts are becoming bluer. That means more parts are reaching the desired noise threshold value. But if I go to the RGB pass, you can see even though the sample rate pass is significantly different, but the overall quality of the render has not changed that much. In fact, it's a lot hard to see any difference. And the same thing is true if we take a look at the next render in which max subdivs was set to 24. It's a bit cleaner compared to our previous render, and the sample rate pass is a lot bluer. That means most of the scene is reaching that specified noise threshold. As it is obvious from these renders, you cannot expect to only increase the max subdiv number and get more noise-free renders each time. In this render, for example, where the min subdivs is 1 and max is 24, most of the areas are reaching that noise threshold level without using all the 24 subdivs. So in order to make the render more noise-free, we need to make the algorithm more sensitive to noise, and we do that simply by decreasing the noise threshold value. And when we do that, now we need to use more of the max subdiv samples to reach that particular noise threshold and therefore getting cleaner render. If I go to my render settings, let's make sure max subdivs is 24, and now let's decrease the noise threshold to 0.005. And let's take a look at the render. As you can see, it's a lot cleaner compared to our previous render with max subdiv set to 24 and noise threshold of 0.01. And we can compare these guys as A and B sides and see how better this one is getting. And as you can see, the new render is a lot cleaner because V-Ray is more sensitive and uses more samples. We can compare the two renders in the lighting and reflection passes as well, and obviously the new render is cleaner every single time. Now, in the sample rate pass, it looks like our previous render is bluer in general compared to the new render, but it doesn't necessarily mean cleaner render, right? The reason the previous render is bluer is because the noise threshold is higher and therefore less sensitive, and we can reach that noise threshold using less samples. But in the current render, noise threshold is lower and V-Ray is more sensitive, therefore it uses more samples out of that 24 max subdivs in more areas to reach that sensitivity level. Now, to make this issue more clear, in the next render I have set the noise threshold to 0.1. Now the sample rate pass is almost completely blue, and it means V-Ray can reach that noise threshold by using less samples. That's why we don't have any noticeable red part, which represents the max subdiv number. And if I take a look at the RGB pass, as you can see, it's very, very noisy, even though we have the same max subdiv number as our previous render. But because the noise threshold is higher, it doesn't use 24 subdivs. In fact, it doesn't get close to this number, and in most parts, probably a max subdiv of 4 will be enough to get to that high noise threshold level. Now, let me load the render with max subdiv set to 24 and noise threshold set to 0.005. I also have another render in which the max subdivs was set to 50 with the noise threshold of 0.01. And as you can see, the render with max subdivs of 24 and noise threshold of 0.005 is cleaner compared to this one. The same thing is happening here, even though the max subdivs is higher. Because the noise threshold is also higher, V-Ray wouldn't use all the max subdivs. And if we take a look at the sample rate pass, we have a very blue pass where mostly min subdivs are used. When I say min subdivs here, it doesn't necessarily mean 1, because any number between 1 and 50 subdivs can be used in this render. Where it's pure blue, we are using min subdivs number. In these dimmer green areas, we are using bigger numbers than the min subdivs, but still closer to the min subdivs compared to the max subdivs. In the brighter green areas, we are using subdivs closer to max subdivs, and in the red areas, we are obviously using the max subdivs. So as this scene is mostly blue, it means we haven't used the max subdivs number or anything close to it that much. If we don't have any noise in the final render, that's okay, but in this case we do have noise and therefore forced to decrease the noise threshold value to get more noise-free renders. Okay, let me set the max subdivs to 24 and noise threshold to 0.01. It seems confusing, but I invite you to rewind and watch this lesson and this section a few times because it's not an easy subject and you really need to watch these videos a few times to grasp the concept fully. I also want to talk about mean shading rates and divide shading subdivs in this lesson. Now, if you remember from our previous section, any light has a subdivs parameter to control its quality. So if I select any of the lights in the scene, you can see in its sampling rollout we have a subdivs option. The same thing is true for materials and other effects in the program. These subdivs values are working and affecting the scene in conjunction with the subdivs values in the image sampler rollout. We can say that V-Ray needs two types of samples. We have image samples that relate to the pixel values and composing the final image. And we have shading samples for computing effects like glossy reflection and refractions, global illumination, area shadows, and other blurry effects. We can call the first kind of samples our primary samples and second type are secondary samples. The way it works, we can prioritize our primary samples over our secondary samples. That means I can set up my render settings in a way that allows me to let my primary samples take over the render and control the sampling of everything in the render. And that is done by increasing the max subdivs number in the image sampler rollout and decreasing the noise threshold. But normally it leads to higher render times. What you want to do is to balance between your primary and secondary samples. The option responsible to control that balance is mean shading rate. In this new release of V-Ray 3, basically all the subdivs in the lights and materials are controlled automatically by V-Ray using this mean shading rate. It basically balances between the samples that you have in your image sampling rollout and how many samples to be used in your shading effects. And as I mentioned, this option is responsible to control that balance is mean shading rate. This option controls the number of rays shot for image samples or anti-aliasing versus rays for shading samples like blurry effects, including lights with area shadows, blurry or glossy reflections and refractions, GI, and so on. Increasing this value means less time will be spent on anti-aliasing or image samples and more time on shading samples. Now let's take a look at a few renders with different mean shading rates. To increase the speed of this lesson, I've just rendered a portion of the image. The first render has the shading rate of 1. So for each anti-aliasing ray, there would be 1 shading ray. In the second render, mean shading rate was set to 3. So for each anti-aliasing ray, 3 shading rays. Basically, more effort will be put into the lights and materials and GI, etc. The next render, it was set to 6. Then 10. Then 16. 64. And 256. Each time we increase mean shading rate, we focus more on our secondary rays compared to our primary rays. From a certain point, you can see the render time increases, and in this case, from the mean shading rate of 10 upwards, the render time has increased. Now, if I compare the mean shading rate of 3 to 256, you can see the version with higher mean shading rate is clearly cleaner, but also the render time is much higher. And we can probably get a cleaner render with something like the default value of 6 and instead decreasing the noise threshold value. In most cases, you don't need to change this value at all. Next, we have divide shading subdivs. Shading subdivs here is the subdivs for lights, materials, GI, etc. Earlier in this lesson, you remember I saying that the image samples and shading samples work together. The way they relate to each other is like this. Let's select the light number 3, and as you can see in its sampling rollout, its grayed out subdivision is set to 64. As we know, the actual number of samples is the square of this value, so 64 by 64 equals 4096. And our max subdivs is 24, so 24 by 24 equals 576. The real number of shadow rays for this light will be 4096 by 576, which equals to 2359296, right? That's a lot of samples, 2,359,296 samples per pixel. We can actually see these numbers here in the DMC calculator. To do so in the global DMC rollout, enable use local subdivs. Now, if divide shading rate is enabled, it reverses this behavior from multiplication to division. For the time being, let me just disable divide shading rate and see those numbers that I just mentioned. As you can see with the current settings, we are going to have a minimum of 615 shadow rays and a maximum of 2,359,296 shadow rays per pixel. But when divide shading rate is on, the number of shading samples will be divided by the number of image samples. So in this case, the subdivs is 64. The actual samples are the square of this value, so 4096. The max image subdivs is 24, so the samples are 24 by 24 equals 576. Now we simply divide 4096 by 576, the result is 7.1. And as you can see in the built-in calculator here, we get at least 8 shadow rays per pixel, and we can go up to 4096 samples. The reason this option exists, divide shading rate, is when we actually increase our image samples, the shading samples can be decreased. And as the image samples can take over everything, if the settings are high enough, we wouldn't need to calculate all that extra shading samples. Now let me show you two renders with and without divide shading subdivs. Now remember that I have high subdiv value for my lights and materials in the scene, and because use local subdivs is enabled, we will use these subdivs instead of automatically determining their subdivs based on the mean shading rate value. In the first render, divide shading subdivs is on and the render time is 6 minutes. And in the second render, it is off and the render time is almost 45 minutes. But obviously, as we are using a much higher shading samples, the render is a lot cleaner compared to the previous results. We have talked about a lot of things in this lesson and it might be confusing. So let's close the frame buffer and get back to our render settings. In most cases, you really don't need to alter mean shading rate or divide shading subdivs. So let's make sure they are 6 and enabled respectively. Also, in the global DMC controls, let's disable use local subdivs and let the viewer decide the number of shading or local subdivs, obviously based on the mean shading rate value. Most of the time, you can get extremely good results by only tweaking min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise threshold values. So if you are not that much into tweaking to get perfectly optimized results, these 3 parameters are enough to control all the important aspects of your render. So for this image, and based on all of that experience we had with this scene, for the final render, I'm gonna set the mean subdivs to 1, max subdivs to 24 or 32 here in this case, and noise threshold to 0.005. And all the other image sampler settings are set to their default values. The local subdivs of the lights and materials also won't be used, as we let viewer to select proper subdivs for them based on the mean shading rate value. I mentioned we have also a rug in the scene. I'm gonna render 2 versions, one with and one without the rug. Also in the comment tab, I'm gonna increase the width and height to 1400. In the GI tab, I'm gonna set the irradiance map subdivs to 85. And in the frame buffer, let's make sure region render is disabled and start rendering the scene. I'm just gonna go ahead and show you the results at the frame buffer. This is our first render with the rock, and as you can see, it's pretty clean and it took about an hour to render. And the second render without the rock, and this one took 30 minutes to render. If I zoom in, you can see we have a pretty clean render. There are still some noise, but not that noticeable, and we can get rid of them. If we take a look at the denoiser pass, you can see it's absolutely perfect. Now let's quickly do some color correction. Just enable the white balance and set the temperature to something like 7600 or something like that to warm up the render a bit. Also, if you want, you can add a bit more contrast in the curve corrections, but in this case, I'm just gonna go ahead and leave it like that for you. And let's make sure we are in the denoiser pass. Let's zoom in and enjoy our two renders. So that's about bucket image sampler. I will see you in the next lesson for progressive image sampler, which is going to be a short and sweet lesson. See you there.